Hello, I'm Caroline Brown, and this is me in the University Archives where I work. The Dundee University online culture blog this week is running a series of posts on the theme of well together. So I thought it would be a good idea to give us a couple of short talks about how archives relate to mental well-being. So the first one I'm going to talk about today is our collections that relate to mental health, and then later on I'll talk about how we use those collections. So how can we hold records that relate to mental health? Well, that's because we have the archives of NHS Tayside. So we have information about boards of management of healthcare, we have information about hospitals, and we have information about what were called asylums in Dundee, Perth and Angus. Now, if I say that word asylum, I expect a lot of you will think of something like this, of Bedlam. And certainly before the late 18th century, care for people with any kind of mental illness was pretty poor. People were cared for by religious houses, or there might have been a room attached to a workhouse or a hospital. And it wasn't until 1781 that the first specialised hospital, the first specialised asylum, was founded in Scotland. And that was in Montrose, and that would become known as Sunnyside Asylum. Now, Sunnyside Asylum became a model asylum for the rest of Europe, with a lot of physicians travelling to Montrose to see the care that the patients were given. It was founded just by private subscription, charitable donations, because it wasn't until the second half of the 19th century that local authorities began to found district asylums. And in the 19th century, in fact, we have a lot more records relating to the hospitals and the asylums because care was a lot more regulated from that period on. The common factor with many of the asylums that were founded around this time is that they were separate from the towns or cities that they served. They were often beautiful buildings in glorious surroundings, as you can see here for Murray Rural Asylum in Perth. And that was partly because people felt that in order to help people recover, they had to be separated from their normal lives, from the difficulties that might have been causing them problems. They should be well looked after, well cared for, treated as individuals, given the opportunity to have regular exercise and feel valued in terms of the environment in which they were cared for. And you can see here the sheer scale of Murray Rural Asylum in 1889. You can see the terraces where patients took exercise, and you can see that the patients were split into female and male wings. And if we go in a little bit closer, you can see that there are, in fact, a lot of single bedrooms as well as dormitories. So I find it fascinating to look at the records of our 19th century asylums because there's much there to feel encouraged by and to feel inspired by. But there's much there that might cause us a little bit of hesitation, particularly in terms of diagnosis. So these are the possible causes of insanity in 1900 in one of the asylums. And you can see that it's split into moral and physical causes. Moral, perhaps what we might call mental causes. And a lot of the patients in an asylum were there just because an asylum was a place of sanctuary. There was nowhere else that they could be cared for or treated. So you see things like people have problems with alcohol. You see things like adolescence. People were admitted to asylum if they had epilepsy or if they had problems with pregnancy, or what we might call postnatal depression now. And this was really an attempt to work out what might cause people's issues. So even things like love affairs or business trouble were recorded. And there was a genuinely attempt to think quite creatively about how patients might be helped. This is a photograph album from the 1860s, so pretty early photography. You can see that some of the patients are having their heads held, and that's because the photographic process took so long. They needed some physical assistance with keeping still. But you can also see here that there is a photograph of an ear. Throughout this album there are a number of photographs of ears, and that's because the physicians that took these photographs was investigating whether there was a correlation between the shape of the ear and whether or not a patient was susceptible to mental illness. And in fact he decided that the shape of the lobe had something to do with this. In terms of treatment, the 19th century was actually quite, as I say, encouraging in its treatment. It treated patients as individuals. It saw them as resident in the hospital rather than incarcerated in the hospital. And you can see here from this register of restraint, this covers 3 years in the life of the hospital, and very few people are recorded as having been restrained. And again, you remember the huge plan that I showed you before. There are just a couple of very small little rooms that are noted as being padded or strong rooms. You can see them on the right hand side here. In fact, the asylums in the 19th century were really not as you would imagine, particularly if you were imagining that picture of Bedlam that I showed you before. Admittedly, this is for private patients, but this is the drawing room, the dining room in Sunnyside, and it's quite incredible in terms of its decoration and its furniture. And this is a ward, a single private room for a male patient. And again, this was for paying patients. This was before the NHS, and people could pay up to £30,000 to stay in the asylum. But from the evidence that we have, even what were called the pauper patients, that was the patients who were supported by charitable subscription or by local funds, even they were fairly well cared for. You can see here the medication perhaps that was given to the private patient. In 1 year they had 53 gallons of whiskey and an awful lot of snuff and tobacco. But the care is demonstrated throughout the records. You see here that there is an emphasis on making sure that patients were clean, that they were well looked after, that they had a regular routine, and that they were well and regularly fed. And you do find that a lot of people left the asylum having recovered, and this was partly because they were given that chance to live in a calm environment and to have regular food and to be looked after properly. And for many people that wouldn't have happened in their normal day-to-day lives. I particularly like the last sentence here. Attendants who have charge of patients engaged in outdoor work must not only carefully superintend them, but work with them and encourage them. And how far that was actually true, I don't know, but it does indicate that there was a sense of almost partnership here, which I find interesting to think about. And certainly the asylums encourage what you might call occupational therapy, so outdoor and indoor work that perhaps help patients or residents feel valued. And there are a lot of social events organised, like this Highland Games, for example. I like the way that the men were rewarded with tobacco, whereas the women had to have tea. And lots of entertainment, so dancing. People came into the asylums to put on concerts and so on. And in fact, patients, particularly, again, the paying patients, I must admit, were encouraged to be creative themselves. So Sunnyside had its own patient magazine with information about the farm and about the weather and about cricket matches, and with poetry written by patients and with drawings produced by patients. And the person who edited this Sunnyside Chronicle was actually the father of Arthur Conan Doyle. His name was Charles Ultimate Doyle, and he's there, that gentleman with the amazing beard in the background. And he's clutching what I like to think of as his sketchbook, because he created a lot of amazing sketches while he was in Sunnyside. And it's thinking about people as individuals that the archives can really help with. So we see all these people here, and we actually have information about them in the archive. We have the case notes of patients. And here's an example of a case note of a man called Thomas Kerr, who was admitted in 1903 to Murray Royal Asylum. And he's actually written his own biography, and we have a photograph of him. He looks a very distinguished gentleman. We have information about what he looked like, a huge amount of information, physical information about him. And we also have information about his family, because people were very keen to see if they could trace issues such as alcoholism or mental illness from generation to generation. Thomas actually had a fairly sad life. His parents wouldn't let him leave home. They forced him to stay and look after them until basically they died. Once they died, he left home and he got married 8 months later, but it was only very shortly after that that he was admitted to an asylum where he spent the rest of his life. But for me, the fact that we have a record of him and we can read about him and remember him is really important. And that's the same with all of the people who appear in our archives. And I think that it's a real privilege to look after the evidence that they lived and the information about them. And so when I do my next talk, I'm going to talk about some of the records that we have and how we use them with different individuals and community groups and how that might impact on mental health care.